At Thanksgiving, my family called me a disgraceful single mom. My dad kicked me out by screaming, "Get out." I just said, "All right," and walked away quietly. They did not know they were living off my $94 million empire. The next day, I canceled all my family's transactions and I left for my beach house in Honolulu. The china plate shattered against the hardwood floor. Pieces of ceramic exploded across the dining room, scattering into the spilled cranberry sauce and ruining the pristine white rug my mother prized so highly. My father, Drake, stood towering over the table, the thick veins in his neck bulging against his stiff, heavily starched collar. He slammed his fists down on the mahogany wood, rattling the heavy silver flatware and causing the crystal wine glasses to tremble. He lunged, his massive, calloused hand locked onto my wrist. His grip bruised my skin instantly, biting into my flesh with a furious, unyielding pressure. He jerked my arm downward, shoving me backward with all of his formidable weight. My hip slammed hard into the sharp oak edge of the credenza. Pain shot up my spine, a hot, electric jolt that stole the breath straight from my lungs. I tasted the sharp, metallic tang of blood in my mouth, where my teeth had clamped down on my lower lip. 7-year-old Brian let out a piercing, terrified scream. He dropped his handmade paper centerpiece, a small turkey he had spent 3 hours coloring just for this dinner, and scrambled under the heavy table, trembling like a trapped animal. The room went dead silent. Over a dozen extended family members, aunts, uncles, and cousins, sat completely frozen in their high-backed chairs. Nobody moved to help. Nobody raised a hand or a voice. My own father had just physically assaulted me over a holiday dinner, and the rest of them just watched, their eyes wide, their mouths clamped firmly shut in cowardice. The nightmare did not start with that shattered plate, nor did it begin when the dinner was served. The rot had been building for hours, seeping through the walls of the sprawling Savannah estate like a slow-moving poison. I am Emmanuel, 34 years old, and a single mother who had spent her entire adult life trying to buy the love of people who fundamentally despised me. Earlier that afternoon, the massive house was already suffocating beneath the heavy scent of roasting turkey, expensive cigars, and stale bourbon. I had stepped out of the sweltering kitchen to check on my son, only to find my older brother, Thomas, pinning Brian to the corner of the expensive leather sofa in the den. Thomas was shoving his smartphone a mere inch from Brian's face. The sounds of rapid gunshots, screaming, and graphic, hyper-realistic digital violence blasted from the tiny speaker. Brian sat entirely paralyzed, his small knuckles turning white as he clutched a decorative throw pillow to his chest, his eyes wide with fear. I crossed the room in 3 massive strides and snatched the device directly out of Thomas's hand. I did not raise my voice, but my glare promised absolute war. Thomas just leaned back into the leather cushions and smirked. He crossed his arms behind his head, wearing that same entitled, sickeningly arrogant grin he always wore when he knew he held the ultimate protection in this house. He was the golden boy, the untouchable heir apparent, despite being a 36-year-old man drowning in secret debts. Drake stomped into the room before I could even open my mouth to demand an explanation. He did not ask what had happened. He did not care about the tears welling in his grandson's eyes. He pointed a thick, shaking finger right at my chest. He yelled that Thomas was just trying to make the boy a man. His voice echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, bouncing off the expensive artwork and reflecting every single failure he had ever pinned on my shoulders. He called me a worthless, divorced failure. He said a weak, pathetic woman like me would only ever raise a weak, useless child. The absolute venom in his tone was designed to crush my spirit, to remind me of my exact place in the strict hierarchy of his domain. I turned my head toward the doorway, looking directly at my mother, Valerie, begging for a lifeline. She sat completely still in her velvet armchair just across the hall. She lifted her crystal wine glass to her perfectly painted lips, took a slow, deliberate sip, and let out an annoyed, exasperated sigh. She told me to stop making my father mad. She told me to just take it, for the sake of the family. She wanted me to absorb the poison, to swallow the humiliation, so her perfect, heavily curated holiday picture would not have a single unsightly smudge on it. Her silence was not passive, it was an active, violent weapon. By the time everyone finally sat down for the main course, the grand dining room was packed to the brim with extended family. Drake held court at the head of the long table, playing the role of the benevolent, wealthy patriarch. He swirled his expensive scotch and loudly bragged about his massive financial success. He gestured grandly to the crystal chandeliers hanging above us and the pristine, hand-carved crown molding lining the walls. He claimed it was all the direct result of his brilliant investments, his superior intellect, and his relentless work ethic. He commanded the room, soaking in the admiration of relatives who were all too eager to drink his liquor and eat his food. Then, his bloodshot eyes locked onto me across the length of the table. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut right through the soft background music. He announced to the entire table that I was nothing but a charity case. He called me a parasite, a leech sucking the life out of his hard-earned retirement, claiming he only allowed me to sit at his table out of the sheer goodness of his Christian heart. He called me a parasite, but the arrogant, posturing man at the head of the table had absolutely no idea that the supposed parasite he was spitting on was the only thing keeping a roof over his head. I stared down at my untouched food, pressing my fingernails so deeply into my palms that the skin broke. Let him yell, my inner voice whispered. Let him play the untouchable, magnificent king of his hollow castle, my e-commerce logistics company, built from scratch during sleepless nights while rocking a colicky baby, pulled in tens of millions of dollars every single year. An anonymous, ironclad shell company under my direct control held the actual deed to this very house. Every single month, I secretly bled $20,000 from my own private accounts to cover their underwater mortgage, their elite country club memberships, and Thomas's absurd luxury car leases. I bought the very turkey he was carving. I paid for the crystal glass he was currently swirling. I funded his entire delusion. For years, I had made myself incredibly small. I hid my massive financial success because I foolishly thought my humility and my quiet financial support would eventually earn their genuine love. Staring at Drake's sneering face and Valerie's complacent, enabling smile, a freezing, absolute clarity washed over my entire being. My silence had not bought me peace. It had only funded my own severe abuse. They were standing directly on a trapdoor that I had built, insulting the very person whose hand rested firmly on the lever. My hip throbbed against the oak credenza. Drake breathed heavily, chest heaving under his tailored shirt. The room waited for me to break. They expected the usual routine drop to my knees, beg forgiveness, apologize for existing, and desperately try to glue the shattered china back together. That was our script for 3 decades. I pushed myself upright, smoothed my skirt, and walked straight past Drake. I crouched under the mahogany table and pulled Brian into my arms, pressing his tear-stained face into my shoulder to block out the family's judgmental stares. I carried him down the hall to the closet, grabbing our winter coats and draping his favorite fleece blanket over his trembling shoulders. Before leaving, I paused in the grand foyer. I pulled an unmarked manila folder from my tote bag and slid it onto the credenza next to Thomas's photograph. Inside rested login credentials to a corporate trust fund. I knew Thomas was drowning in underground gambling debts, with loan sharks demanding immediate payment, desperate, greedy, and devoid of morals. He wouldn't resist. The folder was perfectly placed bait. The front door clicked shut behind us. The freezing November air shocked me fully awake. I strapped Brian into his car seat and started the SUV. As tires crunched over the gravel, my phone buzzed. A text from Thomas flashed. He called me a pathetic loser and ordered me never to show my face again. He thought he had won, leaving the wealthy kingdom entirely to himself. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat and pressed the accelerator. 30 minutes later, we checked into a downtown hotel. I bathed Brian and tucked him into bed. I rubbed his back until his breathing slowed and his eyes closed. Only then did the adrenaline fade, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I opened my laptop at the desk. My main wealth management dashboard loaded a sprawling web of accounts, property deeds, and automatic payments. Every single one fed the Savannah estate, pumping life support into a dead family. Without hesitation, I placed my fingers on the trackpad. One click sold Drake's luxury car loans to a ruthless asset recovery agency. Another click revoked the shell company's protection over the house, flagging the Savannah estate for immediate foreclosure. A third click severed the $20,000 monthly umbilical cord keeping their credit cards and country club memberships alive. The financial guillotine dropped in absolute silence. Across town, Thomas made his fatal move, finding the manila folder. He typed the routing numbers into his phone, drooling over the seven-figure balance, desperate to pay his bookies. He initiated a massive wire transfer, routing the money offshore to hide his tracks. A red notification pinged on my laptop. The transaction was complete. Thomas thought he stole my emergency stash, but that account was a meticulously designed honeypot under heavy federal monitoring. Moving the money across state lines triggered an automatic, irreversible federal wire fraud alert, instantly flagging his IP address and device. The trap snapped shut. My brother had just handed himself to the FBI on a silver platter. 3 days later, I relocated us to my actual home, a sunlit sanctuary in Sedona, Arizona, sitting on the balcony. I opened the home security app on my laptop. The Savannah estate was fully wired with hidden cameras. As the legal owner, I held master access. I clicked the Grand Foyer's live feed and unmuted the audio. Drake was hosting a lavish dinner party, surrounded by wealthy friends and local politicians. He held a tumbler of scotch and a lit cigar, puffing out his chest. He gestured toward the expensive art and boasted about his flawless investments. He laughed, telling the admiring crowd that superior genetics and relentless work were the secrets to his wealth. His toxic, entirely unearned arrogance bled through the screen. A violent pounding rattled the front doors, slicing through the soft jazz. The heavy doors pushed open before Drake could set down his glass. Men in dark tactical vests with federal lettering flooded the grand foyer. I leaned closer to the screen. Blood drained from Drake's face, leaving it a sickly gray. His jaw went slack, and the scotch glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor. Thomas sauntered from the kitchen with a smug smile. The second he saw the agents, his knees buckled. 2 men rushed forward, slammed him against the expensive wallpaper, and cuffed his wrists with a sharp click. Thomas broke instantly, sobbing heavily. He screamed that it was a mistake, that the trust fund belonged to his sister, and that he just needed to pay his bookie. Every frantic word was a legally binding confession. He destroyed himself in front of the entire party, revealing the desperate criminal underneath. Drake snapped out of his shock and lunged forward, raising his voice. A man in a cheap suit stepped into his path, shoving a clipboard against Drake's chest. On top was a certified 24-hour eviction notice, through the front windows. The true devastation unfolded. Repo men dragged steel chains up the driveway, hooking them to the axles of Drake's leased sports cars. Tow trucks roared to life, yanking the luxury vehicles into the dark. Valerie stood frozen at the staircase, hands shaking. She covered her mouth, eyes darting between her handcuffed son and humiliated husband. Her perfect world, built entirely on my suffering, was burning to the ground. The wealthy guests offered no support. Stepping back in self-preservation, they scrambled toward the exits. Drake grabbed his closest golfing buddy, begging for a short-term loan or a lawyer. The friend just shook his head, pulled away with sheer pity, and walked out. Drake tried to shout, using his patriarch voice to threaten lawsuits. The lead agent turned his back. The repo men ignored him. Drake's fake identity dissolved. The terrifying monster from 3 days ago was gone, replaced by a trembling, ruined old man standing in spilled liquor amid the wreckage of his stolen life. Just 72 hours ago, Drake stood over me, demanding submission. He built his ego on my money, and I just pulled the pin holding it together. Now, the mahogany table where he smashed my plate would be auctioned off. The sprawling estate was no longer theirs. I watched them lose everything. Closing the laptop, I took a deep breath of desert air. Morning sun burned away the chill over Sedona's red rocks. I stood on the balcony, coffee warming my hands, looking out at the quiet, golden desert. My phone vibrated against the glass table, flashing Valerie's name. A few days ago, that would have sent me into an anxious spiral. Today, my pulse stayed calm as I answered. Heavy sobs blasted through the speaker. Valerie frantically begged me to wire $50,000 for Thomas's bail. She wailed that deputies had padlocked the estate, forcing her and Drake into a cheap roadside motel, complaining about the sheer indignity. Then, she pivoted to her favorite weapon, guilt. She demanded I empty my accounts to save the family name, crying that a good daughter never abandons blood, ignoring that they abandoned me decades ago. She insisted I fly back and fix the disaster, expecting her panic to be my emergency. I took a sip of my coffee. The desperate noise from the speaker sounded like a complete stranger's problem. I leaned into the microphone. My voice dropped, cold and level. You told me to suffer for the sake of the family, I said softly. Now it is your turn. Happy Thanksgiving. I pressed the red button. I blocked and deleted her number permanently, severing the final thread. I set the phone down. Below, Brian chased a butterfly across the patio, his joyful laughter echoing off the canyon walls. The suffocating weight of my past dissolved. Total closure. My life was finally mine. 6 months later, I sat in the back of a federal courtroom in Atlanta. Thomas stood in a faded orange jumpsuit, his perfectly styled hair a greasy mess. His arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a broken man. The gavel struck. The court sentenced Thomas to 48 months for felony wire fraud and ordered $240,000 in restitution. He whipped his head around, desperately searching the gallery for his little sister to bail him out. I stared right through him, my face stone. Drake and Valerie weren't there to comfort their golden boy. They were drowning in their own ruin. The bank foreclosed on the Savannah estate. Drake's attempt at Chapter 7 bankruptcy failed when forensic accountants uncovered his massive web of offshore debts and fraudulent loans. The social execution was equally brutal. The country club publicly revoked his membership. The wealthy men who once drank his scotch now crossed the street to avoid him. The church community Valerie had spent decades impressing stopped answering her calls. Their pristine facade crumbled, leaving them pariahs. When autumn returned, I pulled a stained envelope from my mailbox. The return address was a low-income apartment in Atlanta. I recognized Valerie's frantic handwriting immediately. Inside, The handwritten pages were a masterpiece of toxic manipulation. She wrote about her failing health and Drake's depression, demanding I come home and fix the family. She tried to rewrite history, claiming the violent shove was just a minor misunderstanding from holiday stress. A year ago, those words would have sent me into a spiral of guilt, drafting desperate replies to defend my reality. Now, I felt no anger or pity, only profound indifference. I walked over to the fireplace, tossed the letter onto the embers, and watched the toxic words curl into ash. That evening, my doorbell rang. My business partner brought roasted vegetables, my neighbor an apple pie, and Brian's teacher a stack of board games. We dragged extra chairs around the dining table, filling the room with warmth. Laughter echoed through the house. Nobody walked on eggshells to appease a tyrant. When Brian accidentally knocked over a glass of water, nobody screamed or threw a plate. My partner just tossed him a towel with a joke. Looking around at these incredible people, I knew this was my chosen family. The suffocating darkness of Savannah felt like a forgotten nightmare. Listen carefully. The people who bleed you dry scream the loudest about your flaws. Drake projected his own deep insecurities onto me. Facing his financial dependence on a single mother would have destroyed his fabricated reality. So he abused the hand that fed him. Valerie was even more dangerous. As a silent enabler, she weaponized guilt to protect the abuser, sacrificing the victim to keep her comfortable illusions intact. Enablers watch you bleed, then hand you a mop and blame you for staining the floor. If you take anything away from my survival, let it be these 3 rules. Rule number 1. Misplaced forgiveness is severe self-harm. Tolerating abuse doesn't earn respect. It trains abusers to hit harder. You cannot love someone into treating you right if their identity relies on keeping you beneath them. Rule number 2. You cannot out-argue a gaslighter. Stop explaining your pain to people who benefit from your silence. The only way to win against someone committed to misunderstanding you is to walk away. Your absence is the only boundary they cannot manipulate. Rule number 3. Blood is biological, but family is earned. Loyalty must be mutual. You owe nothing to people who treat you like a disposable stepping stone. Don't let society convince you to set yourself on fire to keep toxic people warm. Have you ever shrunk yourself to keep the peace where you weren't respected? If you had the power to walk away today and build a life on your own terms, would you leave the toxic table or stay and try to glue the broken pieces back together? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. Build your sanctuary and never apologize for protecting your peace. I am Emmanuel, and I am finally free.